Welcome to Part 3 of Status versus Relationship. Part 3 turns from the main argument to the way key passages are often read. If the first two parts establish that salvation is a real relationship with God, rather than a detached status, this part asks how Scripture should be interpreted in light of that fact. The focus here is simple. Many verses are used to answer questions they were not written to answer. Some passages speak about God's faithfulness and protection. Others speak about human participation, warning, and the danger of turning away. Clarity comes when each text is allowed to answer its own question.
At this point in the discussion, we have already established that the language of salvation in the New Testament consistently describes a living relationship. Terms such as knowing, abiding, and walking are not labels applied once, but realities that exist as they are lived. They describe participation, responsiveness, and ongoing engagement. That framework now gives us a stable base from which to examine a common interpretive move that often goes unnoticed. There is a subtle shift that occurs when certain passages are used to support the idea that a relationship with God cannot be abandoned. The shift is not always obvious because the verses being cited are real and meaningful. The issue is not with the verses themselves, but with how they are being used. To see this clearly, it helps to slow down and ask a simple question of any passage. What kind of question is this verse answering? Some passages are answering the question, how strong and faithful is God? Others are answering the question, what does it mean to actually live in relationship with Him? These are not the same question, even though they are closely related. Consider the statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John about his sheep. He says that no one will snatch them out of his hand. This is a powerful declaration. It tells us something essential about God. It tells us that his hold is not fragile. No outside force can overpower him. No enemy can take someone away from him against his will. But notice what question that statement is answering. It is answering the question, can anything outside of you take you away from God? The answer is no. Now compare that with a different question. Can a person stop participating in the relationship? That is a different kind of question. It is not about external force. It is about internal response. The problem arises when a statement that answers the first question is used as though it were answering the second. When that happens, something subtle but significant has changed. A verse about God's protection is being used to make a claim about human participation. This becomes easier to see if we step outside of theology for a moment. Imagine someone says, no one can force you out of this relationship. That statement is about protection from outside interference. It tells you that no third party can break what exists between you and another person. But that does not mean you cannot choose to walk away. Those are two different claims. One speaks about protection, the other speaks about participation. If someone takes the first statement and uses it to prove the second, they have used the right sentence to answer the wrong question. This is the shift that often occurs in discussions of once saved, always saved. The same pattern appears when we consider the warning passages. In places such as the Epistle to the Hebrews and the second Epistle of Peter, the language is direct and serious. It speaks of falling away, becoming hardened, and not continuing. These passages are clearly addressing the question, what happens if a person stops responding to God, stops participating, and turns away? These are relational warnings. They make sense only if the relationship itself is at stake. However, another shift sometimes occurs. These warnings are reinterpreted to mean that a person will not lose the relationship, but only lose rewards. In that case, the kind of statement has changed. A warning about the relationship has been turned into a warning about benefits within a guaranteed outcome. Once again, the issue is not that reward language does not exist. It does. But when all warnings are reduced to rewards, the force of the relational language is lost. The warning no longer addresses whether the relationship continues. It only addresses how much one receives within it. This shift can be felt even at an everyday level. If a relationship is truly in danger, the warning is not, you may receive less benefit. It is, you may lose what you have. That is how relational language normally works. When we put these pieces together, the pattern becomes clear. Some passages emphasize the strength and faithfulness of God. They assure us that nothing external can take us away from Him. Other passages describe what it means to actually live in relationship with Him, and they warn us not to abandon that way of life. Both kinds of passages are necessary, but they answer different questions. Clarity comes when we allow each passage to answer the question it is actually addressing. Confusion arises when we take a passage that speaks about God's strength and use it to conclude that human participation no longer matters, or when we take a relational warning and reduce it to a statement about rewards. A simple way to keep this clear is to ask, each time we read a verse, what question is this answering? Then we ask, am I using it to answer a different question? That discipline alone resolves much of the tension. In the end, the picture that emerges is both strong and coherent. God's hold is secure. His faithfulness does not fail. No external force can remove a person from His care. At the same time, the relationship itself is something that is lived. It exists in knowing, abiding, and walking. Those realities require participation. If that participation ceases in a settled way, the relationship those terms describe is no longer present in the same sense. This preserves both sides without forcing one to cancel the other. It allows the language of Scripture to stand in its natural meaning, rather than being reshaped to fit a single model.